No one living in that distant age could have truly imagined what the changing winds would bring. As the sun dipped lower each evening and the long golden days of summer faded into memory, an unfamiliar chill crept into the world, a subtle, silent invader. The trees that once danced with green abundance now seemed to shiver, their leaves blushing red and yellow before falling away like quiet promises. The streams, once lively and quick, slowed their laughter and gathered icy edges. Every living thing felt the difference, from the birds that flew restlessly overhead, searching for a warmth that was fading, to the small creatures that scurried through the underbrush, clutching at anything edible before the land grew empty and still. For the small bands of people who called this wild and restless place home, the world had always been full of uncertainties. Yet there was a rhythm to the old days, a sense that, no matter how fierce the storm or hungry the night, the earth would provide. Roots, berries, wild game, clear water. Each summer had been generous, each autumn a festival of ripening and plenty. But now, with the first real cold upon them, a new kind of unease settled into every heart. It was not hunger, not yet. It was not even fear, not exactly. It was the strange and heavy feeling of change, an awareness that the rules of the world were shifting, and no one could predict what might come next. Nights grew longer, the sun slower to rise. In the half-light of dawn, mist curled low across the valley, clinging to the stones and tree trunks, hiding the shape of things that might be moving out there in the dimness. Breath steamed in the air, and the ground felt harder, colder beneath bare feet. The familiar songs of insects faded, replaced by the distant howl of wind and the cautious, muffled sounds of people gathering closer together. Within their rough shelters of stone and wood, families pressed against each other, seeking warmth and comfort in the uncertain dark. The old stories, once told for amusement around the crackling fire, now took on a sharper edge. Every tale of cold and struggle seemed more real. Every whispered warning about the world outside a little less exaggerated. Children who had raced through the woods without a care now stayed close to their elders, their eyes wide and watchful. Food became a constant worry. What if the wild plants did not return? What if the herds moved on and did not come back? Each day, the search for something to eat grew longer, the rewards smaller. The promise of the earth, so reliable just weeks before, began to seem uncertain. Roots grew harder to find. Nuts disappeared beneath a blanket of fallen leaves. And even the game seemed more wary, sensing the coming hardship. Every meal was earned with effort and risk. Every discovery of a hidden cache of berries or a fat rabbit, cause for celebration. The air itself felt different, thinner, sharper, alive with possibility and danger. Every wind that swept down from the mountains brought the scent of something distant and unknown, a world beyond the edge of memory. Fires, which once offered only warmth and light, now became guardians against the creeping cold. Their flickering glow drew everyone inward, closer, as if the circle of flame might hold back whatever was lurking just beyond the reach of sight. The elders, those who remembered more summers than most, spoke in low, careful voices, recalling seasons that had seemed longer and easier. Some claimed to have seen winters before, but none could remember a time when the earth had felt quite so silent, so withholding. It was as if the land itself were holding its breath, waiting to see who would endure and who might fade away. Yet even as uncertainty pressed in from all sides, a different kind of spirit began to rise among the people, There was a strange thrill in facing something so vast and uncontrollable. Bonds of family and friendship, often taken for granted in times of ease, grew stronger. Eyes met across the firelight with new understanding, a silent promise to share what little there was, to protect each other against the unknown. Laughter, though rarer, was brighter for its rarity, and the simplest pleasures, a scrap of roasted root, a story well told, became treasures. The world outside might have been turning cold and hard, but within each shelter, within each heart, there was a quiet defiance, a sense that somehow they would find a way. Even as the sun vanished earlier and earlier, even as the shadows lengthened and the old world seemed to slip away, people clung to the hope that together, with courage and cunning, they could outlast the winter's wrath. It was not just a fight against cold or hunger or the silent dark. It was a battle for memory, for meaning, for the belief that life would continue. No one knew how harsh the coming days would be, nor what they might have to sacrifice, but all could sense that these moments, these choices, these struggles would be remembered. They would become the stories told to children in some distant, warmer future, proof that once, when the world seemed most unfriendly, people had found a way to stay human. And so, as the first true frost silvered the grass, and the night air cut sharper than any stone blade, the people of that ancient world gathered together. They waited, alert and anxious, at the very edge of something vast and unknown. The first winter of their lives had begun, and none of them would ever be quite the same again. The shock of the cold came not with a warning, but with a suddenness that seemed almost cruel. It began as a chill in the bones at sunset, a sharpness in the air that caught in the throat and made fingers ache, but it quickly became something no one could ignore. By the time darkness swallowed the last trace of twilight, the temperature had dropped so rapidly that even the oldest among them, those who claimed to remember times of hardship, looked to the sky with silent questions. The wind, once playful and full of summer's gentle scents, had turned into a force that prowled the open places, seeping through every gap, whistling past the edges of crude shelters, scattering dried grass and fragile hopes alike. It was the nights that truly taught the lesson of winter's power. The first hours after sunset brought a cold that bit deep, finding its way beneath furs and skins, reaching into the very center of every living thing. The people, gathered in small clusters beneath rocky outcrops or under the boughs of ancient trees, pressed tightly together for warmth. They wrapped themselves in whatever they had, animal hides still carrying the scent of the wild, rough woven grass mats, layers of leaves and moss hastily pulled into place. It helped a little, but as the hours dragged on and the world outside turned silent and unwelcoming, the bitter truth set in. The cold was relentless, and their bodies were far less prepared than their spirits. Each new night brought new desperation. Without the comfort of fire, there was no barrier between them and the elements. The darkness felt absolute, heavy and unmoving, full of sounds that twisted the imagination. The snap of a twig, the distant call of an animal, the whisper of wind through hollow spaces. Eyes strained in the blackness, searching for any hint of threat or hope. There was no way to chase away the shadows, only to sit quietly, breathing slowly, trying not to waste precious energy. In the absence of warmth, people grew restless. Children whimpered softly, mothers rocked them with numb arms, fathers and elders took turns keeping a fragile watch, peering into nothingness. Sleep came in fits and starts, a half-conscious state always aware of the cold pressing in, always ready to wake at the slightest sound. Some tried to remember the comfort of fire, the memory of orange light flickering on the walls. But such memories only made the present ache more. The need for shelter became an obsession. Each day at first light, before frost could melt and the cold lose its grip, the strongest ventured out to search for safer places. A cave, a deep hollow in the earth, a stand of trees so dense that the wind could not reach inside. There were disagreements, desperate arguments over where to go and what to try. Sometimes the best-looking spot turned out to be full of sharp rocks, or already home to animals far less willing to share. The days grew short, the sun barely cresting the horizon before retreating again, giving little time to explore and even less time to make repairs. As the cold deepened, so did the sense of vulnerability. For the first time, people saw themselves not as the rulers of their small world, but as fragile visitors in a land that could turn hostile in a single night. Even the bravest among them found their confidence tested. The world outside, always mysterious, now seemed to actively resist their presence, closing in with every gust of icy air. In this new reality, the small things began to matter in ways they never had before. A patch of dry grass found beneath a boulder became a prize. A spot where the wind was blocked by a fallen tree meant the difference between a restless night and utter exhaustion. When the sun finally rose each morning, it revealed the marks left by their struggles: scattered nests of leaves, half-finished walls of stone, the imprints of bodies curled tightly together for warmth. Yet the chaos of these first nights was not without its lessons. Those who paid attention learned quickly what worked and what did not. They noticed which shapes in the land offered more protection, which materials held heat, which strategies brought the least suffering. They learned to listen to the wind, to read the patterns of snow and frost, to understand the subtle ways the world warned them of coming storms. Every hardship, every sleepless hour forged a new determination, a resolve to adapt, to endure, to make the next night a little less harsh. The shock of the first true cold had stripped away any illusions of safety, but it had also awakened a new kind of resourcefulness. The darkness was still thick, the cold still biting, but now there was the beginning of a plan, a rough sense that survival was possible, if only they could work together, if only they could learn fast enough. The struggle had become not just a test of strength or endurance, but a challenge to the mind and spirit, a demand to become something more than they had ever been before. And so, as the longest night finally gave way to a dim, reluctant morning, the people of that forgotten age gathered their scattered belongings, wrapped themselves in whatever warmth they could find, and set out to face another day. The memory of those first freezing nights would never truly leave them, but neither would the knowledge that, even in chaos, even without fire, there was always a way forward, if only they could find it. Survival quickly became a matter of instinct, a primal urgency that burned brighter with each passing hour. The memory of sleepless, shivering nights etched itself into every muscle and thought, until nothing else seemed to matter as much as the search for shelter. No one needed to speak the truth aloud. Without a safe place to hide from the biting cold and prowling dangers of the dark, their hopes would vanish like mist at sunrise. The hunt for food could wait. The hunt for warmth and safety could not. As daylight crept across the frost-bitten land, small groups splintered off, each driven by an unspoken agreement. The elders pointed toward distant outcroppings. Young ones scrambled ahead, alert for the shadowy promise of a cave or crevice deep enough to swallow the wind. Every hollow in the hillside, every fallen tree, every cluster of rocks drew their attention. What once had been just part of the scenery now became a potential fortress. Eyes scanned for signs that others had come before: animal tracks, the faintest curl of smoke, an abandoned nest that might be reworked into something more. Tension simmered beneath the surface. As the need for refuge grew desperate, so did the willingness to take risks and make difficult choices. It was not long before the first conflicts erupted. Two families, each clinging to hope, stumbled upon the same shallow cave. Words were few. Voices rose, hands gestured, and faces tightened. The urgency of the moment stripped away the old rules. Suddenly, ancient bonds and familiar alliances could shift, replaced by the raw calculations of survival. A well-thrown rock, a threatening posture, or simply the weight of numbers might decide who would stay and who would move on. In some moments, the promise of safety outweighed every other loyalty. Yet, even in the heart of competition, the seeds of cooperation began to grow. It soon became clear that no single person could stand alone against the challenges winter presented. The caves that looked promising at first revealed their limits: too shallow, too damp, too crowded to truly protect anyone for long. When a great bear's tracks appeared near the mouth of one shelter, it was obvious that only a united group could drive such a powerful creature away, or at least keep watch together and share the burden of fear. Under threat, the rivals of yesterday found themselves bound together by necessity, forced to negotiate, to compromise, to invent new forms of sharing that could keep more people alive. The lessons came hard and fast. A cave won by force today might become a trap tomorrow, when snow drifted high against the entrance or water trickled down through cracks in the stone. The oldest members recalled stories of friends lost to cold and collapse, warning the rest to trust not only to luck, but also to wisdom and caution. Every failure became a shared memory, a cautionary tale that would change how they acted the next time. People learned to look for signs: the angle of a slope, the pattern of wind-blown snow, the dryness of moss underfoot. Each clue, noticed and remembered, brought a better chance at making it through another night. Luck played its role too. Sometimes, by pure chance, a wandering child would stumble upon the entrance to a deep, dry cave hidden behind thorns, or a fallen tree would reveal a burrow large enough to shelter an entire family. Such moments were celebrated with quiet, exhausted joy, a pause for gratitude, a rare moment to smile and believe, if only briefly, in fortune's favor. Yet fortune could just as quickly turn, and no one forgot it. The growing importance of the group transformed everything. Tasks that once belonged to the individual, gathering branches, arranging stones, patching holes with mud and leaves, became shared labors. Even children contributed, their small hands quick and clever, their sharp eyes spotting what adults overlooked. Laughter returned, now and then, not as a luxury, but as a balm for tired spirits, a sign that hope remained in the most unlikely places. Each success in finding shelter carried its own challenges. As families merged into larger groups for mutual defense and warmth, new tensions flickered beneath the surface. Sharing was not easy, nor was it natural for people who had long relied on themselves. Old habits died slowly, but the cold was a stern teacher, and it allowed no room for stubbornness. Simple rituals, dividing space, agreeing on quiet hours, creating rules for who would tend the fire or keep watch, began to shape the daily rhythm of survival. Trust had to be earned and re-earned, sometimes broken and rebuilt. But with each trial, the group became a little stronger. What started as the frantic, solitary hunt for shelter slowly evolved into something else, the early outlines of community. Instincts sharpened by fear began to bend towards something more. Eyes that once watched only for threats now searched for signs of comfort, for the small gestures that signaled acceptance or reassurance. Shelter was no longer just a place to hide from the cold, but the heart of something new, a place where lessons could be shared, where losses and victories alike became the story of all, not just one. By the time the sun dipped once again behind the frozen horizon, the search for refuge had taught more than anyone expected. In the struggle to survive, people learned to see each other with new eyes. The longing for safety, once a private ache, became a shared purpose, a fire burning not just in the hearth, but in every heart, guiding them forward into whatever the next cold night might bring. Mistakes were inevitable in a world so newly hostile, where every choice was made without the wisdom of experience, and each day brought fresh, unfamiliar dangers. The desperate need for shelter and warmth had forced the group to act quickly, but haste was its own kind of risk. Even as hope flickered within the safety of their newfound refuges, the cost of ignorance revealed itself, sometimes suddenly, sometimes with a slow, gnawing certainty that left no one untouched. The first tragedy unfolded with the simple logic of chance. A cave that seemed perfect, hidden and dry, was chosen in the fading light. Spirits were high as the group crowded inside, congratulating themselves on their luck. For once, the wind could not reach them, and the thick layers of old leaves seemed to promise comfort. But as the night wore on, a different sound crept into the darkness. A low, restless growl, echoing from the very depths of the stone. Too late, they understood that the cave was already home to something wild and territorial. Fear pulsed through every heart as eyes widened in the gloom. There was no time for thought, only instinct. A scramble for the narrow exit, bodies tangling in panic, precious belongings left behind, hope replaced by raw, overwhelming terror. When the cold morning arrived, the cave stood silent and empty. The lesson had been seared into memory. Not every shelter offered safety, and some mistakes left a mark that would not be easily erased. Other errors were quieter, their consequences unfolding slowly, but just as painfully. In the rush to gather food before the coming of snow, some ventured farther than they should have, lured by the promise of a rabbit's trail or the hope of hidden nuts. Paths that seemed familiar in summer became confusing mazes under frost and low, shifting light. It was easy to lose one's way, and a single wrong turn meant a night spent alone, far from the warmth and protection of the group. The cold was merciless, sapping strength and hope. When the lost finally returned, their faces pale and silent, they carried with them not only hunger, but a shadow of fear that spread through everyone who saw it. There were other, more subtle dangers, hidden in the very materials they depended upon. When the group found a stand of green, leafy plants clinging stubbornly to life near a stream, it seemed a blessing, until stomach pains and weakness swept through those who ate them. No one had known to avoid these leaves, yet now everyone learned. The price was days of misery and a new layer of caution in every decision about what to gather, what to eat, what to share. Each mistake became a story, a warning passed from mouth to mouth with a seriousness that allowed no argument. Sometimes the failures belonged not to the group, but to individuals. One evening, in a moment of frustration and pride, a young hunter insisted on venturing out alone to prove his skill. The forest was thick with shadows and strange sounds, but he pressed on, believing himself clever and strong. Hours passed with no sign of his return. Anxiety twisted in the hearts of those who waited by the fire. When at last he reappeared, empty-handed and shivering, his confidence was gone, replaced by humility and a willingness to listen. The elders offered no scolding. None was needed. The lesson was plain to all. Pride and recklessness were luxuries no one could afford. The price of ignorance was not always paid in grand disasters. Sometimes it revealed itself in a slow erosion of hope. An attempt to build a wall of stone against the wind collapsed under its own weight, crushing a carefully hoarded supply of dried berries. A fire, left untended for a moment, flickered out in a gust of wind, leaving the group huddled in darkness for another freezing night. Each failure, no matter how small, brought with it the sting of regret and the hard necessity of adapting. No one could afford to repeat the same mistake twice, and so, night after night, the group became sharper, more watchful, more deliberate.
Fear was an unforgiving teacher, but it did not destroy them, it transformed them. The sting of loss brought the group closer, replacing casual trust with a fiercer kind of loyalty. They learned to listen to each other's doubts, to test every new idea against the wisdom of the group, to share stories of failure so that no one would suffer needlessly. The memory of those early mistakes lingered in every cautious step, every careful glance, every whispered warning in the dark. No one spoke openly of the things that had gone wrong, but in their silence was a promise to carry the weight of their losses together, to let every lesson shape them into something stronger, something more capable of facing the relentless winter. As the days crept onward and the world grew colder still, the group moved with a new sense of purpose. Every error, every loss, every moment of fear had become a thread in the fabric of their survival. What had begun as chaos and confusion was slowly transforming into wisdom, the kind that could not be found in stories or taught by words, but only earned through living, and through enduring what could not be avoided. The lesson that no one could truly survive alone emerged slowly at first, then all at once, with the clarity of something undeniable. In the first days of hardship, it was tempting for some to believe that they could endure the cold on their own strength, relying on old habits, secret hoards, or stubborn pride. A few even tried, quietly breaking away at dusk, slipping into the darkness with what little they could carry. Their absence lingered in the camp, heavy and unspoken, yet always noticed. Soon enough, word would spread that their footprints had been found in the snow, fading into emptiness. The silence they left behind was more chilling than the wind. Those who remained quickly saw what the solitary ones did not. Winter was not just a test of endurance, but of unity. Alone, a person could not gather enough food, nor build a shelter sturdy enough to withstand the night. Hands that shivered in the cold worked more slowly, fumbled more often. Eyes grown weary from lack of sleep missed the subtle signs of danger. Even the strongest grew weak, and the cleverest could not outwit the elements forever. At night, the darkness pressed in from every side, broken only by the faint glow of shared fire, a fire that needed tending, feeding, and watching, tasks too great for a single soul. Trust was not given freely. In the beginning, every stranger was a possible rival, every outstretched hand a potential threat. Old disputes and new suspicions lingered in every glance. But as the nights grew colder, gestures of kindness and sacrifice began to melt these invisible walls. A woman giving up her last bit of dried meat for a child not her own. A man surrendering the best sleeping place to an elder weakened by fever. Such acts did not go unnoticed. Each one became a seed, slowly sprouting into something more resilient than fear, loyalty, respect, and a fragile hope that, perhaps, together, they could weather what lay ahead. The cost of this new unity was real. Sometimes it meant sharing less food or taking greater risks for the group's sake. Old grudges were set aside, if not forgiven, for the sake of survival. Voices that once shouted over each other in anger now found compromise, speaking softly in the firelight as plans were made and doubts confessed. The group became a tapestry, woven from many different lives, all pulling in the same direction. Arguments still arose over hunting routes, sleeping spots, the division of work, but the awareness lingered that to splinter was to lose everything. Survival was no longer the prize of the strongest, but the reward for those who could build bridges and bind wounds, even the unseen ones of the heart. There was pain in this togetherness too. Sometimes it meant losing something dearly held, or bearing the sorrow of another's misfortune. But in these moments, a new kind of strength emerged, quieter and deeper than muscle or willpower. People found comfort in shared laughter, in the steady rhythm of familiar chores, in the knowledge that someone would remember them if they faltered. Stories were passed down and retold, not only of the dangers outside, but of small triumphs inside, of times when the group had faced fear and hunger and overcome them by standing side by side. Day by day, a new sense of belonging began to replace the isolation of earlier times. The fire became more than warmth. It became a center, a beacon, the place where the scattered fragments of the group could gather and become whole. Alone, a person's story might end in silence. Together, their voices rose above the wind, weaving a promise that, as long as they held on to each other, winter might not win after all.
The old world, where each hunted, ate, and slept alone, seemed further away with each passing night. What mattered now was not just the strength of one, but the courage and generosity of many. In the darkness and cold, something new was born, the first fragile shape of community, destined to change not only that winter, but every season that would follow. The struggle against the cold grew more desperate with each passing night. Even as the group huddled together, their bodies pressed close in makeshift shelters, there was an unspoken sense that the balance between endurance and defeat was becoming ever more fragile. Fingers numbed by frost could barely untie knots or hold the simplest tools. Every task, from preparing food to building shelters, became a test of willpower as much as skill. The darkness, vast and impenetrable, pressed in from all sides, and the wind never seemed to tire of reminding them that nature was indifferent to their suffering. It was in these harshest moments, when hope thinned to its last thread, that the longing for fire turned from a distant memory into a burning obsession. Some elders spoke of flames seen long ago, bolts of lightning that set whole trees ablaze, wildfires that devoured everything and left behind only warmth and light for a single fleeting night. But no one among them had truly mastered fire, and so it remained an elusive miracle, a force to be feared as much as sought. Still, as desperation grew, so did determination. The group began to watch the world with new eyes, searching for any clue, any secret the land might offer up. Every day, new experiments unfolded around the camp. Dry sticks were scraped against stones until hands bled. Flint was struck, sparking bright but dying quickly on damp moss. Some tried to blow gently on the tiniest embers, coaxing them to life with the patience of someone willing to wait forever. There were failures, so many failures that, for a time, laughter at each new mishap became a way to keep despair at bay. Sometimes a wisp of smoke would appear, only to vanish as quickly as it had come. Other times, frustration boiled over, and tools were cast aside, while the cold watched in silent amusement. But human beings, when pressed against the hardest edge of survival, are not easily broken.
One evening, after a day of endless wind and disappointment, a young woman sat apart from the rest, turning a branch over and over in her hands. The memory of a lightning-struck tree, its wood warm and fragrant, its heart still glowing red, haunted her. With nothing left to lose, she tried something different. She placed dry grass beneath a hollow log and spun the branch rapidly between her palms, pressing harder than ever before. The friction made her arms ache, but she did not stop, not even as the skin on her hands grew raw. Suddenly, a faint tendril of smoke curled upward. The group fell silent, every gaze fixed on that fragile promise. Breath caught in a dozen throats as the smoke thickened, darkened, and finally, with a sharp intake of air, a spark leapt into flame. It was a tiny, flickering thing, barely more than a whisper of light, but it was enough. Someone rushed to feed it with more grass and bits of bark, while others shielded it from the wind with their bodies and whatever scraps of hide they could muster. As the flames grew, so did a kind of wonder. The cold retreated, just a little. Shadows that had clung to every corner of the shelter were pushed back by dancing gold. For the first time in memory, faces glowed with something other than exhaustion, awe, relief, and a cautious joy. Hands reached out, not just for warmth, but to touch the miracle itself, as if afraid it would vanish at any moment. That first night with fire was a turning point. The group gathered close, soaking up every bit of heat the new flame offered. Food that had been hard and tasteless was roasted, transforming into something softer and more nourishing. Old stories were shared in the light, their meanings shifting in the glow of a new reality. Sleep came easier, guarded by the comfort of warmth and the knowledge that the dark had lost some of its power. But fire brought more than comfort. It demanded care, attention, and discipline. The group learned quickly that a moment's inattention could reduce all their hopes to ash. Shifts were organized to watch the fire, to feed it at regular intervals, to gather dry wood and guard against sparks. What started as a desperate experiment became a ritual that bound them together, a shared responsibility and source of pride. The invention of fire changed everything, not just because it made the cold bearable, but because it made the impossible feel possible. No longer did the night seem endless or the wind unconquerable. With fire, the group claimed a new kind of power over their world, a power born not of force, but of curiosity, persistence, and the willingness to try again even after every failure. In the flicker of that first successful fire, something new was born, a sense of destiny. The flames were more than survival. They were the first beacon of civilization, the spark that would lead, one day, to stories, to art, to dreams. From that night onward, every winter felt just a little less infinite, and every heart, even the most weary, held on to the memory of that miracle, a reminder that together they could change not only their fate, but the very world itself. The promise of fire's warmth had barely begun to knit the group together before the wilderness reminded them that they were not alone. Winter's silence was deceptive, a hush that masked the constant presence of eyes watching from the shadows. The world beyond the light of the flames belonged to others as well, to creatures whose hunger had grown as sharp as their claws, whose patience was measured not in hours but in seasons. Each night, as darkness settled, the wind carried with it a chorus of distant howls and guttural roars, reminders that the struggle for survival was shared with wild neighbors every bit as desperate as themselves. The first true encounter came on a morning painted with frost. As the group scouted for fresh tracks to hunt, they found the prints of wolves, deep, determined, moving as a pack through the snowdrifts. The people knew these signs. Wolves were cunning and relentless, moving silently as shadows, coordinating their efforts with a unity that sometimes mirrored the group's own.
In the heart of winter, with prey growing scarce, wolves grew bolder. On some nights, glowing eyes circled just beyond the reach of firelight, their low growls a warning and a challenge. Food scraps had to be buried far from camp, and even then, the group woke some mornings to find prints and scattered remains where animals had tried their luck. It became a nightly ritual to bank the fire higher and keep a vigilant watch, knowing that the cold was not the only threat pressing in. But wolves were not the only hunters. There were other predators in the ancient forests, beasts whose power made the night itself seem to tighten around the camp. Tracks much larger than any wolf's told of the great bears, stirring from uneasy sleep to scavenge what little food the season still offered. Sometimes the group would hear the low, guttural rumble of a bear in the distance, a sound that chilled more than any wind. They knew to keep away, to treat every promising cave with suspicion, for a bear's den was not always easy to spot until it was too late. Once, a pair of foragers stumbled upon a massive paw print half filled with snow, and they turned back without a word, their silence more urgent than any shout. Even more fearsome, though more rarely seen, were the saber-toothed cats, shadows among shadows, moving with a grace and silence that made them almost invisible. Stories told around the fire painted these predators as spirits, neither fully of this world nor entirely apart from it. Their massive fangs, glimpsed only in the briefest flashes, were the subject of both dread and wonder. No one ever saw one approach directly, but now and then a sudden silence in the forest, a rush of birds, or the uneasy restlessness of smaller animals signaled that one might be near. The group learned to move quickly and quietly, avoiding the open ground and never lingering in the same place too long. Hunting, which had once been a daily routine, became a dance of caution and nerve. Every trip beyond the safety of the fire meant moving into territory claimed by others. The people adopted new strategies, moving in larger groups, setting guards to watch for ambush, and communicating with subtle signs and gestures. Sometimes they found themselves tracking prey only to realize that they themselves were being watched, their own trail shadowed by something silent and unseen. The winter's hunger made every animal more daring, more willing to take risks, and so the people, too, became more resourceful. The tension between predator and prey was everywhere. On rare days, a successful hunt brought back not just meat, but stories of close escapes. A sudden charge from a wild boar, a standoff with wolves over a fallen deer, the eerie quiet that preceded an encounter with something far larger. Each victory was hard won, each meal earned at the risk of becoming a meal for another. The firelight, once merely a comfort, now felt like a fragile shield against the darkness beyond. Yet these challenges sharpened the group's instincts. They became students of the wilderness, reading signs with growing skill. A broken branch, a tuft of fur snagged on a thorn, a pattern of fresh snow disturbed in just the right way. They learned which animals could be scared off, which demanded respect, and which, like the great cats, could only be avoided. Children listened with wide eyes as the elders recounted close calls and hard-won wisdom, the old stories slowly evolving with every new season. In the depth of winter, aggression ruled the wild. Every animal, from the smallest fox to the largest bear, acted with a hunger and urgency born of survival. The group, too, felt that sharpness in their own hearts, a growing awareness that they were not masters of this land, but participants in a relentless contest. Each encounter with their wild neighbors was both a risk and a lesson, a reminder that survival in this world was not a solitary achievement, but a shared, ever-changing struggle, where every night brought a new test and every dawn was a hard-earned reward.
As the world hardened under its white mantle and the promise of easy meals faded, the group found their very relationship to food transforming in ways they could never have imagined during the generous days of autumn. Gone were the moments of idle gathering, when berries and fruits hung heavy on the branches and roots could be dug from soft soil with little effort. Now every bite was a triumph of will and invention, every mouthful earned by risk, luck, and a kind of stubborn creativity that only true hunger can teach. The first sign of real change came with the disappearance of familiar plants. Under the deepening snow, wild herbs, bulbs, and edible greens vanished as if erased from the earth. The sweet tang of berries was replaced by the bland crunch of frozen tubers, scavenged from beneath icy layers with aching, reddened hands. Nuts, once overlooked or taken for granted, became treasures. The group spent long hours cracking them open by the fire, sharing the fragments with an intensity that bordered on reverence. Even the youngest learned to listen for the telltale snap of a shell and to hold each piece carefully, knowing that such riches would not come again until spring. Hunting became both more vital and more fraught with risk. Many animals had migrated or gone into hiding, their trails lost beneath the snow, their movements cautious and rare. Still, hunger drove the people to follow even the faintest signs. Tracks winding through the trees, a patch of disturbed snow, a scattering of feathers. When prey was caught, every part of the animal was used. Meat roasted over the hard-won flames, bones cracked for marrow, skins saved to patch clothing and shelter. Organs that might have been ignored in easier times were now considered delicacies, rich with nutrients desperately needed. Nothing was wasted, for to waste was to court disaster. The need to store food for the days when hunting failed led to new experiments and accidental discoveries. Some meat was dried slowly near the fire, transforming into tough, salty strips that would last for days without spoiling. Bones were boiled for hours to create thick, warming broths, their steam carrying a scent that brought the entire group close, drawn by memories of comfort and the promise of strength. Leftover fat was collected and mixed with crushed nuts or wild grains to make dense, high-energy cakes that could be tucked away for journeys or leaner moments. Such innovations were not born from luxury, but from necessity, and each new method was quickly shared and adopted. Sustenance also came from the wild places that only the most determined dared to search. In icy streams, some learned to break through the surface and snatch sluggish fish with sharpened sticks, their hands burning with cold but victorious when they succeeded. The bark of certain trees, carefully stripped and boiled, offered a thin, bitter soup, hardly a feast, but enough to fill empty stomachs when nothing else could be found. Once, a lucky forager unearthed a hidden cache of honey in the hollow of a fallen tree, and the sweetness was so overwhelming that it felt like a dream, a brief return to the forgotten pleasures of the warm months. With each passing week, eating became not just a way to survive, but a ritual that bound the group together. Meals, however humble, were taken communally, shared evenly no matter who had found the food. Stories grew around the act of eating, tales of past feasts, old recipes, dreams of spring's return. Children learned to ask questions, to observe and remember which plants could be trusted and which must be left alone. Even the act of hunger itself changed, becoming a constant companion that sharpened the senses and reminded everyone of what truly mattered. The first winter forced a kind of culinary creativity that no one could have predicted. The group learned to eat what the land offered, to prepare it in new ways, and to appreciate the nourishment that each meal brought, however meager. In this way, the changing menu became more than a story of deprivation. It was a testament to adaptation,
to the relentless hope that, by learning and sharing, the people could transform hardship into tradition. The memory of this winter would remain long after the snow melted, shaping not just what was eaten, but how it was valued, turning every future meal into a celebration of survival itself. It wasn't only hunger and cold that haunted the group as winter tightened its grip. Gradually, a new set of challenges crept into their midst, unseen, silent, and just as relentless. It began with weariness that even a night's rest could not heal, then coughs that lingered in the smoky air, shivers that persisted even near the fire, aches that moved from bone to bone like a shadow. At first, these afflictions were brushed aside as the simple toll of hard living. But soon it became clear that something deeper was at work, something that not even the strongest among them could always shrug off. Illness came in many forms. There were the sniffles and coughs that spread from one to another, making sleep fitful and the days long. Some grew so weak they could not join the hunts or gather wood, and their absence weighed heavily on the group's morale. At times, a fever would strike without warning, burning hot, and then leaving its victims spent and trembling. These sudden ailments were mysterious, sometimes fading on their own, other times lingering for days, leaving the group anxious and watchful, searching for patterns, for answers. Hunger made everything worse. The constant gnaw of emptiness weakened bodies and minds alike, slowing recovery, sapping hope. Cuts and scrapes, minor in the warmth of summer, now took longer to heal, becoming red and angry in the cold. Some wounds, untended or dirtied by the harsh environment, festered and spread, forcing everyone to confront the limits of their knowledge and the harshness of nature's lessons. Faced with these trials, the group turned to the world around them in search of remedies. The elders who remembered bits of wisdom from years past became the first healers, pointing to certain mosses that, when chewed or pressed against a wound, seemed to ease pain and slow infection. Bark from certain trees was steeped in boiling water to make bitter teas, sipped in hope of lowering fever. Roots and berries, when found, were mashed into poultices, spread over aches or sore throats. Sometimes these cures seemed to help, other times they did nothing, but the act of trying itself became a comfort. There was trial and error in every new remedy. If a plant eased a cough or soothed a rash, it was remembered and gathered again. If a concoction brought no relief or made things worse, it was quietly abandoned. Knowledge grew in small increments, passed from one to another in whispers and quiet demonstrations by the fire. Children watched closely, learning what leaves to avoid, which bark to harvest, how to recognize a healing herb in the snow. The forest and field became a living pharmacy, though its language was still unfamiliar and sometimes cruel. Losses were inevitable, and each one left an imprint that the group carried with them. When someone could not rise from their bed of hides, when the firelight dimmed in their eyes, the grief was quiet and communal. Yet even in sorrow, there was a search for meaning. Each hardship taught something: how to better insulate shelters against drafts, how to keep wounds cleaner, how to share warmth with those most in need. Mistakes were paid for dearly, but rarely repeated. At times, the group found hope in unexpected places. One morning, after a long night spent tending to the fevered, the elders awoke to find the patient's temperature had dropped. Their breathing eased, their eyes bright once again. Such recoveries brought not just relief, but a sense of wonder at the resilience hidden in every person and the possibilities still offered by the world outside. Even the simple act of caring for one another became its own kind of medicine, a reminder that compassion, too, could be learned and shared. Nature itself seemed at once a threat and a teacher. In the crunch of frozen leaves, the bitterness of a new root, the healing chill of cold water pressed to a burning brow, the group found hints of answers, lessons hidden in hardship. The first winter became not only a test of endurance, but an education, one written in aching bones and whispered prayers, in bitter teas and hopeful hearts. These lessons, earned and remembered, would become the foundation of a deeper wisdom: to listen to the world, to adapt, to persist, and, above all, to care for one another when nothing else could be certain. As winter deepened and darkness stretched longer across the land, something intangible began to settle over the group, pressing in as surely as the cold itself. The world outside their flickering firelight grew stranger, less familiar, a place where ordinary sounds took on new meaning, and shadows seemed to shift and breathe of their own accord. Fear, never far from their minds, became a constant companion. Each gust of wind howling across the open ground was heard as a warning. Every branch snapping in the forest hinted at more than mere animal life. It was in these long, uncertain nights that imagination awoke, filling the empty spaces with stories and spirits, shaping the unknown into the beginnings of myth. It was not only children who stared wide-eyed into the gloom, clinging to their elders as the fire burned low. Even the bravest hunters found their thoughts wandering as the hours passed, their minds conjuring explanations for every unexplained event. A streak of northern lights flaring across the sky became a sign, a trail left by ancient spirits, or the breath of a great beast watching over the world. The sudden disappearance of an animal or an eerie silence that blanketed the woods hinted at hidden forces. Illness that struck without warning, storms that battered the camp, dreams filled with voices. Each became a thread in the tapestry of new beliefs. As fear grew, so did the need to find meaning, to imagine some control over the world's mysteries. Around the fire, voices began to tell stories that offered answers. Some spoke of spirits living in the frozen earth, awakened by the cold, who needed to be shown respect or placated with small offerings. Others whispered of ancient creatures, half human and half shadow, who moved through the darkness and watched over the living. There were tales of ancestors who had crossed impossible distances, their courage and wisdom lingering to guide those still fighting to survive. Stories that might once have belonged to one person or family quickly became shared property, told and retold, shaped by each new teller's voice and memory. Rituals sprang from these stories, often humble and improvised. A small pile of berries left at the edge of the fire, a pattern scratched in the frost, a song sung softly as the sun dipped behind the trees. Each act was a way to reach out to the unseen, to ask for mercy, to mark the passage of another night survived. When a hunt succeeded, the first piece of meat might be cast into the fire with a whispered promise, a gift to whatever powers had watched over the group that day. If the wind grew fierce or a member of the group fell ill, a special fire was built and everyone gathered close, offering words of hope or protection, making up chants as they went, each person's breath joining the smoke that rose into the dark. Over time, these stories and rituals became more than distraction. They were a shield, a way to push back against helplessness. Belief offered comfort when logic and effort failed. It drew the group together, giving everyone a role in the nightly battle against the unknown. Elders became not just the keepers of memory, but the guides through this new world of spirits and signs. Children grew up learning to read omens in the stars and to approach the forest with both caution and awe. What might have begun as the flicker of a frightened mind slowly settled into tradition, binding the group across generations. Winter, with its endless shadows and biting silence, became a season of transformation, not just of bodies and habits, but of minds and souls. Fear gave birth to wonder, and wonder to faith, A faith that, somehow, by telling the right story or performing the right ritual, the world could be made a little safer, a little warmer, even in its coldest hours. These first myths would linger long after the snow melted, woven into every tale told by the fireside, every ritual marking the changing of the seasons. In seeking to understand the mysteries of winter, the people discovered the power of belief, a force as necessary to survival as food or fire, shaping not only how they endured the cold, but how they saw themselves and their place in a world forever balanced between darkness and light. Winter wore down even the strongest spirits with its slow, unyielding grip. The endless cycle of hunger, cold, and shadow had etched new lines into every face, hollowed cheeks, and made hands tremble even in rest. There came a time, late in the season, when despair seemed heavier than ever before, a gray fog settling over the group, making every task feel insurmountable. Bodies ached with exhaustion, minds clouded with doubt. Each morning it seemed harder to rise, to believe that the world could ever be green and warm again. Some nights, when the wind rattled the cave entrance and the fire burned low, the silence between heartbeats felt deeper and more final than darkness itself. It was in these moments, on the edge of surrender, that the smallest signs began to matter most. A drip of water trickling from an icicle hinted that ice was losing its hold. The faintest glow in the sky before dawn suggested the days were lengthening, almost imperceptibly, but enough for those who watched closely. In the stillness, the cry of a distant bird sometimes pierced the hush, a sound forgotten for so long it seemed unreal, a memory of life returning. Hope arrived not as a sudden burst, but as a quiet presence, a whisper in the cold. Keep going, keep waiting, the world is changing. Within the group, hope often hid in the ordinary. A child's laughter, thin but stubborn, echoed in the shelter and reminded everyone that joy could survive even in the harshest places. Someone discovered a few green shoots pressing through the snow near a sun-warmed stone, and the news spread like fire, proof that the earth was not lost, that spring had not forgotten them. Old stories, told in the warmth of shared bodies, took on new meanings. They endured, and so can we, the elders said, their voices firmer than their bodies. Each shared meal, each task completed together became a victory, a quiet declaration that they had not been broken. Resilience grew in the space between despair and determination. The group learned to lean on one another in new ways. When one faltered, another offered a shoulder, a bite of food, a word of encouragement. It was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was a silent hand on a trembling arm. Sometimes just a look. Even the memory of those who had been lost was transformed not into paralyzing grief, but into a kind of gentle resolve. Their struggle would not be in vain. Each person, whether young or old, carried the hope of the group, passing it along like a hidden ember, something to guard and protect until it could catch fire again.
Yet not all found hope so easily. Some, worn thin by hardship, turned inward and could not see the small signs. Their strength faded quietly, as if winter had claimed part of their spirit as well as their body. Others, however, found something fierce and bright within, an unwillingness to yield that no hardship could dim. It was never clear why. Sometimes it seemed to come from nowhere, a sudden flash in the dark, a memory, a promise, or simply the stubborn will to see another sunrise. The line between those who endured and those who gave up was fragile, woven from countless threads of luck, kindness, chance, and choice. The first signs of change were cause for cautious celebration. A warm breeze swept through the camp one afternoon, carrying with it the scent of earth rather than ice. The river, silent for so long, began to murmur beneath its frozen skin. The air itself seemed to ease, as if the world were taking a deeper breath. No one dared to believe too quickly, but eyes grew brighter, voices stronger, movements more hopeful. They had survived what seemed impossible, and in doing so had discovered not just the limits of endurance, but the quiet strength of hope, returning like spring itself, fragile at first, but growing with every new day. Through despair, the group had learned what mattered most. Hope did not erase hardship, but it made every struggle meaningful. Every day survived a kind of triumph. Winter would end, as all things must, and when it did, those who remained would carry forward the knowledge that even in the longest, coldest night, the human heart could still find light. As the last, hardest weeks of winter ebbed, something unexpected stirred within the group. Not just relief, but a quiet sense that they had survived something worth remembering. Endurance alone was not enough to carry the spirit through long nights and endless hunger. It was the need for meaning, for celebration, for moments that broke the sameness of hardship, that called the people together in new ways. This was how the first rituals, the first true holidays began, not as grand declarations, but as simple gatherings fueled by gratitude and hope. The earliest festivals were not planned in advance. Often they arose spontaneously from the smallest of good fortunes: a successful hunt after weeks of hunger, the return of a bird no one had heard since autumn, or the sudden warmth of a sunbeam falling across the shelter floor. In those moments, laughter would ripple through the group, hesitant at first, but then louder, echoing against stone and snow. Someone would suggest sharing a rare treat, dividing the last sweet root or a piece of dried meat between everyone, so that no one was left out. The act of coming together, of making a meal or story into an occasion, became its own kind of feast. At the heart of these early celebrations was the fire, a symbol of everything they had learned and endured. On the coldest nights, when fear or hunger threatened to overtake them, the people would build their flames higher than usual, piling on wood and gathering close. They circled around the blaze, letting its warmth and light push back the dark. Sometimes someone would throw a special offering into the flames: a handful of nuts, a carved bone, a piece of woven grass. Each item meant to thank the forces that had kept them safe, or to invite good fortune for the days ahead. These symbolic acts were simple, but they carried weight, filling the air with hope and shared intention. Music and rhythm often grew out of these moments. Someone might begin to drum on a hollow log, keeping time with the beat of the heart or the crackle of fire. Others joined in, clapping, humming, or chanting old songs learned from elders. Dancing, too, found its place. Even when weak from hunger, people moved with a kind of joy, stamping out patterns in the snow or earth, inventing steps that might become traditions. Through movement and sound, the heaviness of winter seemed to lift, if only for a while. Stories became central to every gathering. Around the fire, voices wove together memories of hardship and tales of victory, turning each shared ordeal into legend. Children listened wide-eyed as adults described hunts, storms, or mysterious dreams, learning not just about survival, but about bravery, cleverness, and kindness. These stories did more than entertain. They taught, they bonded, and they gave the group a sense of continuity, a belief that their struggle mattered, that their lives were woven into something larger and lasting. Celebration offered more than distraction from suffering. It transformed pain into purpose, turning each trial endured into a reason to rejoice. Coming together for a ritual meal or dance reminded the group that they were not just a collection of individuals fighting alone.
but a community with shared memory and hope. The sense of isolation, so strong in the darkest months, was replaced by belonging. Even sorrow was lightened, grief eased by the understanding that it could be shared, honored, and eventually healed through togetherness. In time, these small acts grew into tradition, seasonal gatherings, songs that marked the return of warmth, dances that greeted the first green shoots of spring. Each ritual, no matter how simple, was an act of defiance against the darkness, a declaration that life, with all its suffering, was still worth celebrating. The first holidays became the seeds of culture, planting in every heart the knowledge that survival was not enough. To truly live, people needed joy, gratitude, and the shared light of community. These early festivals would echo through generations, turning the memory of hardship into the promise of brighter days, and giving meaning to every winter endured. As the cycle of hardship and celebration repeated, the group began to realize that survival was not only a matter of strength or luck, but of order, an understanding that some voices carried more weight, that certain people held a unique ability to guide, decide, and unite. In the earliest days, leadership had appeared almost by accident. The person who first lit a fire, the one who remembered a healing plant, the hunter who brought back food when hope was thin. Their skills set them apart, but it was necessity that transformed these individuals into something more, into the first leaders. Leadership was not inherited or chosen in the way it would be in later ages. Instead, it arose from the respect quietly earned in moments of crisis. When the wind howled and the group debated whether to move on or stay, it was the calm voice with the clearest memory of the land who spoke, and others listened. When illness threatened to spread, the hands that tended the sick with patience and wisdom became the ones others trusted to organize care and ration scarce remedies. Decisions were born in firelight, in whispered counsel and open debate, but gradually one or two figures became the center around which others gathered. Their confidence, or perhaps their unflinching hope, offered a kind of stability the group desperately needed. With leadership, the need for rules quickly became apparent. In the chaos of winter's early weeks, arguments over food or sleeping places sometimes flared into conflict. Each person's survival instinct was strong, but left unchecked, it threatened to unravel the fragile unity they had worked so hard to build. The cold did not care for disputes. Without cooperation, small grievances could grow into dangers greater than hunger or beasts. So slowly, the group began to agree on boundaries. Who would hunt or gather? How food would be divided? Who would keep the fire? Who would watch for danger? The first laws were not written but spoken, repeated until they became part of the group's rhythm. To be a leader in this world was not to command from a distance, but to serve. The strongest led by example, enduring discomfort and risk so that others would follow willingly, not out of fear but trust. When a choice had to be made, whether to shelter in place or move on, whether to share the last bit of food or save it for a child, the leader bore the responsibility, feeling the weight of every decision as if it were carved into their bones. They listened more than they spoke, gathering wisdom from all sides before choosing a path. In turn, the group watched their actions closely, quick to reward fairness and just as quick to withdraw trust if decisions proved reckless or selfish. Rules grew from lived experience. When a food source was discovered, the leader ensured it was shared, not hoarded. If a dispute arose, the leader and a circle of elders listened to both sides, settling matters with words instead of blows. In time, rituals grew around these moments, gatherings where everyone's voice could be heard, but where the final word belonged to the one entrusted with the group's well-being. Even children learn to accept these new boundaries, finding comfort in the predictability of shared meals and sleeping places, the certainty that someone was always watching over the fire. The change was profound. What had once been a scattered assembly of desperate individuals became a true community, bound together by loyalty, trust, and a growing sense of purpose. The presence of rules transformed winter from a season of chaos into one of resilience. Arguments grew less frequent, cooperation more natural. The laws, simple as they were, became invisible threads, weaving each person's fate into that of the whole. Leadership, too, became a promise, that no one would be left behind, that wisdom and courage would guide them, even when the cold was at its fiercest. In this way, the first leaders and laws gave winter new meaning, not as a trap, but as a test, a chance to build something lasting from the raw materials of fear and hope. Those who endured would remember not just how they survived, but how they learned to live with one another, guided by voices strong enough to be followed and rules wise enough to be trusted. And from these earliest beginnings, the roots of true society took hold, roots that would grow stronger with each generation that gathered around the fire. The relentless cold did more than test the endurance of the group. It forced them to rethink everything they knew about survival. Every biting wind, every failed hunt, every freezing night became an urgent question, and necessity proved to be the mother of invention. With each challenge, the people responded not by surrendering, but by looking for new answers, by shaping the world around them with their own hands, creating tools and technologies that would not only save them through the first winter, but become the seeds of progress for generations. Clothing was one of the first and most vital innovations. At the start of winter, the group had relied on rough hides and loose furs, but these soon proved insufficient as the temperature dropped further. The skin from animals taken in the hunt was no longer used simply as blankets. It was cut, scraped, softened with stones and fat, and then stitched together with sinew to make garments that hugged the body and sealed in precious warmth. Hands numbed by cold learned to thread bone needles, passing them back and forth through thick layers of hide to craft tunics, leggings, and cloaks. The process was tedious, but every improvement, every tighter seam, every new layer meant more protection against the cold. Children wore hoods fashioned from fox fur, while adults wrapped their feet in thick wrappings, learning that the smallest details could mean the difference between comfort and frostbite. Weapons, too, underwent transformation. Spears that had been useful in warmer months sometimes shattered when wood grew brittle with cold. So new techniques emerged. Points of stone or bone were lashed more securely, and the shafts themselves were chosen with greater care, sometimes fire-hardened for strength. Shorter, sturdier weapons were devised for close encounters with desperate animals, while sling stones and throwing sticks were adapted for hunting small, elusive prey. Tools used for butchering, scrapers, knives, awls, were honed sharper and kept close, their importance now as much about clothing and shelter as food. The search for food also led to new inventions. Pit traps were dug beneath the snow, baited and camouflaged, designed to snare animals venturing near the camp. Nets and snares were woven from dried grasses and sinew, set along known trails where rabbits and birds passed in the dawn. In streams that had not yet frozen solid, simple fish traps were placed, their clever construction capturing what little life still moved beneath the ice. Every successful catch was studied, every failure adjusted, each attempt adding to the shared pool of knowledge. These innovations were taught to the youngest, turning survival into a lesson that could be handed down, improved, and refined. Shelter, too, evolved in response to winter's harshest tests. The first simple caves and lean-tos gave way to more sophisticated structures. People learned to block drafts with stacked stones and layers of moss, to build windbreaks from fallen branches, and to line the floors with evergreen boughs for insulation. Some began to construct semi-subterranean dwellings, digging into hillsides and layering the roof with earth, trapping warmth and resisting the cutting wind. The group experimented with different arrangements, shared spaces for warmth and safety, separate nooks for sleeping, areas dedicated to food storage or tool making. The home itself became a kind of living tool, reshaped daily to answer the changing needs of the group. Every new tool or technique brought not just practical benefit, but a sense of empowerment, a feeling that, even against forces as vast as winter, humans could carve out their own chances. As the group worked, shared, and adapted, they discovered that their ingenuity was their greatest resource. These early inventions did more than keep them alive. They connected one person to another, creating opportunities for teaching, for pride, for cooperation. And with every improvement, the memory of hardship was slowly replaced by a growing confidence, a sense that nothing, no matter how cold or dark, could not be faced with clever hands and hopeful hearts. In time, the inventions of that first winter would become the foundations of culture. The bone needle and the fire-hardened spear, the hidden trap and the insulated shelter, these were the gifts of necessity, the first sparks of human creativity in the long night. From those early, clumsy attempts would grow the skills and knowledge that shaped every season to come, proof that even in the harshest winter, the drive to invent and adapt could turn struggle into survival, and survival into something greater still.
Surviving the cold was never just a contest of muscle or clever hands. The greatest test, in many ways, lay within the simmering cauldron of emotion that winter's relentless pressure stirred in every heart. In the close quarters of crowded shelters, old wounds and hidden insecurities surfaced as sharply as the wind outside. Survival depended as much on navigating these inner storms as on keeping the fire burning or finding the next meal. The stresses of hunger and exhaustion made even the smallest disagreement flare into argument. Jealousy simmered when one hunter returned successful and another came back empty-handed. Whispers of favoritism circled if the leader seemed to offer a warmer sleeping spot or an extra morsel of food to a particular family. Old grievances, half forgotten in times of abundance, took on new weight. With nowhere to go, nowhere to escape, tensions sometimes erupted into angry words, glares across the fire, or sullen silence that chilled the air even further. Fear was ever present, not just of the cold or wild animals, but of failing those who depended on you, or of being left out when resources ran thin. For some, worry turned inward, eating away at confidence and hope. For others, it spilled out in sharp tones or bitter accusations. Children sensed every tremor in adult voices, retreating into quiet games or tears when the air turned tense. Even laughter, when it came, was sometimes edged with nervousness, as if too much joy might break the fragile peace. Yet through these struggles, the group slowly learned that no one could endure alone, not just physically, but emotionally. Arguments, when they burst, were often followed by quiet gestures of reconciliation, a shared scrap of food, an apology mumbled in the dark, the leader's patient intervention. The elders played a special role, remembering past conflicts and guiding the group back toward understanding. Sometimes, when tempers ran hottest, a story or a ritual song was enough to cool the air, to remind everyone of the dangers outside and the need to stand together. Forgiveness became as vital as any tool or weapon. Those who could not let go of old slights found themselves increasingly isolated, their bitterness echoing in empty silences. Others, learning from experience, became peacemakers, bridging differences, soothing wounded pride, helping the group to remember that their fate was shared. The memory of those lost or of hardships endured made every squabble seem smaller, every reconciliation more precious. Inside, each person waged their own private battle. Loneliness could creep in even surrounded by others, especially at night, when thoughts turned to loved ones gone or the life that once seemed secure and simple. Some found solace in ritual or routine, a repeated prayer, a whispered hope, a rhythm tapped out on the shelter wall. Others relied on companionship, seeking out a comforting word or a hand to hold in the dark. By enduring and overcoming these inner conflicts, the group gained more than peace. They discovered a new kind of strength. Where once they had been a collection of individuals, each guarding their own heart, they began to understand what it meant to support, to forgive, and to trust. The struggle for survival became not just a physical effort, but an act of courage, a willingness to remain open, vulnerable, and kind even when the world was hardest. In this crucible of winter, the soul learned resilience. The people discovered that pain could bond as well as break, and that true survival required not just endurance of the elements, but the capacity to heal, to reconcile, and to hope again. With each act of forgiveness, each moment of empathy, they grew closer, not just as a group of survivors, but as the first outlines of a community, stronger for all that they had weathered together, inside and out. The first winter was already transforming those who faced it together, but nothing prepared them for the day strange shapes appeared on the horizon. Figures moving through the snow with wary, deliberate steps, the outlines of other people, other lives etched against the cold sky. Until then, the world had seemed both vast and empty, as if theirs were the only story unfolding in all the silent whiteness. Now, with the sudden approach of outsiders, everything changed. A jolt of fear, curiosity, and wild hope rippled through the group, as real and urgent as the crackle of fire in the night. At first, suspicion ruled. Memories of hunger and hardship made the group protective, uncertain whether these newcomers were rivals for scarce food or bearers of unknown dangers. The leaders gathered everyone close, scanning the movements of the strangers, weighing the risks of greeting them against the risk of appearing weak. Every story passed around the fire was suddenly full of new questions. Were these people like them, searching for shelter and warmth, or hunters who might take by force what they could not find? Children peeked out from behind elders, clutching small treasures close, watching with wide eyes. At first, suspicion ruled. Memories of hunger and hardship made the group protective, uncertain whether these newcomers were rivals for scarce food or bearers of unknown dangers. The leaders gathered everyone close, scanning the movements of the strangers, weighing the risks of greeting them against the risk of appearing weak. Every story passed around the fire was suddenly full of new questions. Were these people like them, searching for shelter and warmth, or hunters who might take by force what they could not find? Children peeked out from behind elders, clutching small treasures close, watching with wide eyes. The first encounters were tense, shaped by the necessity of caution. Weapons were kept close, words spoken slowly, gestures exaggerated to show peaceful intentions or to warn of boundaries not to cross. Sometimes a show of strength, an arrow notched, a spear planted in the ground, drew a line between peace and threat. Yet hunger and cold pressed equally on both sides, and necessity forced the first attempts at contact. Shared signs, a broken branch to mark a path, a pile of stones arranged as an offering, opened the door to tentative exchanges. When trust could be built, the meetings brought more than just relief. They sparked the beginnings of something new. Stories told in halting words or gestures revealed that others, too, had learned hard lessons. How to keep a fire burning through a storm. How to recognize the call of danger in the forest. How to treat the bite of cold or the ache of a sick child. Tools were traded, ideas swapped. A different knot for a stronger snare, a sharper edge for a bone needle, a new song for comfort on dark nights. Gifts of food, no matter how meager, became symbols of goodwill. In these moments, strangers became allies. Their wisdom pooled into a collective resource that helped both sides survive not only the season, but the dangers that came with it. But not every meeting ended in peace. There were times when misunderstandings or the memory of old wounds turned caution into conflict. A lost hunting party that wandered too close was met with shouts and raised weapons. A foraging group found their stores raided and blamed the unfamiliar shadows that slipped through the trees. Fights flared quickly, sometimes over the smallest resource: a patch of edible roots, a hidden spring, a warm cave. In the confusion and desperation of survival, it was easy for fear to overpower trust, turning possible friends into sudden threats. Yet even these clashes were not the end of the story. The very act of meeting others forced the group to adapt, to weigh risk against possibility. Leaders who could negotiate, who knew when to stand firm and when to offer peace, rose in importance. Every conflict, every alliance left behind new knowledge, a warning remembered, a skill borrowed, a lesson learned. The idea of us and them began to blur, replaced by a wider sense of the world, one where survival sometimes meant building bridges, and other times guarding borders. Through these first encounters with other tribes, the people learned that the world was bigger and more complex than any one group could master alone. Sometimes strangers brought hope, laughter, and the spark of new invention. Sometimes they forced the hard lessons of vigilance and defense. In both friendship and rivalry, the boundaries of the group's identity expanded, drawing everyone into a network of stories that would shape not only that winter, but every season to come. In a land ruled by hunger and cold, the choice between enemy and ally was never simple, but it was always vital, and the mark it left was written into every story that followed. It began quietly, almost too subtle to trust. At first, just a change in the air, a softness in the light that filtered through the opening of the shelter. The cold no longer felt as sharp on the skin. The wind, so long the herald of hardship, carried a different scent, hints of earth and green beneath the memory of frost. Each morning, survivors blinked awake and found that the endless night was shrinking, the sun rising a little earlier, lingering a little longer above the horizon. The snow, once a fortress and a prison, began to recede. It melted in streaks down the hillsides, trickled into streams that rushed and gurgled with new life, and left behind patches of dark, promising soil. The group watched these changes with a mixture of wonder and caution, not quite daring to hope, but unable to deny the evidence before their eyes. They noticed the first shoots of green pushing through last year's withered grass, trembling but determined. Children reached out with eager hands, marveling at the fragile leaves, pressing them gently between their palms, as if to reassure themselves that the world truly could be reborn. Birdsong returned, hesitant at first, a single note, a flutter in the branches overhead. Then, as days grew longer, the sky filled with wings, with flashes of color and the bold calls of creatures who seemed to know that the cold had finally loosened its grip. These sounds became music to the survivors, a language of hope and return that worked its way into their dreams, echoing through memories of loss and endurance. Life within the group shifted too. Where once every gesture was heavy with fatigue, now laughter came more easily, and movements grew lighter. People stepped outside their shelters not just out of necessity, but from a longing to feel sunlight on their faces, to watch as the world rebuilt itself, moment by moment. Even hunger seemed less oppressive, for now there were new things to forage: tender shoots, early berries, roots swollen with moisture from the melting snow. The rhythms of daily life softened, shaped by the promise that tomorrow would be kinder than yesterday. Those who had survived winter carried invisible marks, lessons etched into every thought and action. The world no longer seemed indifferent or cruel, but a place of cycles, of suffering and renewal, where patience and hope could coax life from the harshest ground. People looked at one another with deeper understanding, bound together not only by what they had endured, but by the knowledge that hardship was not the end of the story. Each new sign of spring, a blossom, a bird's nest, the warmth of sun on bare skin, became a cause for gratitude, a reminder that endurance had purpose. With the return of abundance came a kind of awe. Everything felt sharper, sweeter. The taste of fresh greens, the sound of water, the smell of damp earth. Survivors spoke in softer tones, pausing to listen to the world, as if it might whisper secrets only those who had waited so long could understand. The pain and fear of winter did not vanish, but transformed, woven into the gratitude they felt for every moment of peace, every day spent in the growing light. Life, once a daily battle, became a gift to be cherished. The group moved forward not only as individuals who had survived, but as a community remade by hope. Spring did not erase the memory of hardship, but illuminated it, showing what it meant to endure, to trust, and to find meaning in even the most barren times. As the world awakened around them, so too did the people, stepping out of winter's shadow and into a future bright with possibility. As the world thawed and the days stretched long and golden, the group could finally pause and look back, seeing the full distance they had traveled since the first frost crept over the land. It was not only the earth that had changed, but the people themselves, their faces leaner, their eyes steadier, their gestures gentler and more deliberate. Around the renewed fire, beneath a sky now alive with birds and color, the survivors found themselves drawn to memory, piecing together the story of how winter had shaped them in ways no summer ever could. The hardest moments were not always those of hunger or cold, though these trials had carved their mark into every bone and habit. What lingered most were the times when hope seemed out of reach, when the group faced uncertainty, confusion, and the threat of being torn apart by their own doubts and fears. Nights spent listening to the wind outside and the silence within. Moments of raw honesty when someone admitted they were afraid, or tired, or unsure if morning would come. These were the memories that surfaced first, heavy with the reminder of just how close the edge had been. Mistakes, so many, so costly, stood out now as signposts in the story. Choosing the wrong shelter, trusting an untested food, misreading the signs in the snow. Arguments allowed to smolder, dividing the group when unity was most needed. Pride that delayed apologies or blinded someone to a safer path. The first lessons of fire, learned through failure and persistence, became symbols of a larger truth.
that survival demanded patience, humility, and the courage to keep learning, even in the face of repeated disappointment. Every wound and loss, every moment of despair had left behind a lesson, quietly transforming weakness into wisdom. Some changes could be measured in small rituals now second nature: checking the sky before sleep, saving scraps that might one day be needed, sharing stories so that the same mistakes would not be repeated. Others ran deeper, altering the very way people saw themselves and each other. Trust, once hard to give, had become the group's lifeblood. Compassion, once a rare gift, now bound them in invisible threads of duty and love. The need for leadership and rules, for shared burdens and honest speech, had become as clear as the need for food and shelter. The hardest lessons were those that taught them their limits and, just as importantly, their strength. The memory of those lost, of hardships endured, was held gently now, not as a source of grief, but as a reminder of all they had learned and all they owed to one another. The first winter had taught them that survival was not just about endurance or strength, but about adaptability, the willingness to change, to forgive, and to imagine a different future. It showed that fear could be faced, that mistakes could become wisdom, and that every dawn, no matter how cold, offered a new chance to do better. As they looked around at the world reborn, at the children running over green hills, at the faces that had grown familiar and dear, the survivors understood that the greatest gift of winter was not just that they had endured, but that they had been transformed. They were no longer only a group bound by necessity, but a true community, one that carried forward the memory of every hardship as a guide, a promise, and a foundation for everything that was yet to come. The memory of that first winter did not simply fade when the world turned green again. Instead, it wove itself into the very core of the people who survived. The lessons learned beneath the weight of snow became more than just stories. They were seeds, quietly taking root in the customs, habits, and beliefs that shaped the group's every day. Through hardship and triumph, a new culture was born, one whose origins would echo through the ages. Every ritual of survival, the sharing of food, the telling of stories, the rituals around the fire, became more than a response to need. They became traditions, practiced even when the land grew generous again. The feast that once celebrated the return of a hunter now marked each season's turning, a communal memory of hunger and gratitude. Old songs, shaped by long nights and sharper fears, found new verses in times of plenty, their melodies reminding everyone that joy was sweetest when it was shared. The habit of gathering together in darkness, listening to elders, asking questions, and honoring both the living and the lost became a rhythm that organized each new day, binding the group across generations. Knowledge, once hard-won and nearly lost in every blizzard, was now cherished and passed carefully from one voice to the next. Children learned not only how to build a fire or track a wounded animal, but why such skills mattered, what they meant, what they cost, and how each success had once been the difference between despair and hope. The tools fashioned in those desperate months, needles of bone, traps and snares, insulated shelters, were refined and perfected, their making turned into a kind of art. Every improvement, every new idea was shared, critiqued, and celebrated, because innovation was no longer just a matter of surviving, but of honoring the ingenuity that had carried them through the worst the world could offer. Beliefs grew too, shaped by the mysteries of winter and the hope of spring. The old fears, once raw and consuming, were now transformed into tales of spirits, omens,
and ancestors whose wisdom could be summoned with song or offering. Festivals marked the return of light and warmth, each ritual a promise that the darkness could be held at bay. The first laws and the memory of leaders who had guided the group became the foundation for justice and fairness, ideals that would outlast any single season.
That first winter did more than test the bodies and spirits of those who lived through it. It awakened in them the capacity to imagine, to remember, and to build something lasting from hardship. It was in the firelight of that cold season that humanity's first culture was truly born, a tapestry woven of memory and hope, fear and courage, learning and love. Every winter that followed would recall the first, its lessons echoing in every story, every law, every celebration. The age of mere survival was over. In its place stood the beginnings of civilization, anchored by the wisdom that together even the deepest winter could be endured, and from endurance a new world could be created. Even now, when the world is tamed by walls and windows, when warmth is only a switch away and the threat of cold seems distant, something ancient lingers within us. The memory of that first winter, though thousands of years removed, remains etched into our instincts, woven through our rituals, and pulsing quietly in our longing for comfort and community. We may no longer gather around fires out of necessity, but the need to come together when darkness falls, to share food and stories, to seek out light in the coldest season, persists in countless ways. Our festivals and holidays, marked by feasts, song, and the glow of candles or hearths, trace their lineage back to those desperate gatherings that turned survival into celebration. The customs of gift-giving, of welcoming strangers, of remembering the lost and honoring the wisdom of elders, all carry echoes of a time when sharing was not only kind, but vital, and every small kindness could tip the balance between hardship and hope. Even the ways we build our homes, gather with family, and comfort one another in times of trouble are shaped by the deep knowledge that safety is not found in solitude, but in connection. The fear of winter itself, the shiver that passes when the days grow short, the way we brace against the cold, the almost instinctive desire to draw close to others, belongs to more than weather. It is a memory passed through uncounted generations, a lesson that the world can be unforgiving, but that together we can endure. In stories told by the fire, in the laughter and tears shared during the longest nights, in the persistence of hope even when all seems lost, we carry the legacy of those who faced the first, hardest cold. Our dreams, too, are shaped by their endurance. The longing for warmth, for belonging, for a life bigger than mere survival, drives us forward, toward invention, toward community, toward art and meaning. The desire to leave something behind, to make sense of suffering, to remember and be remembered, springs from that ancient winter, when the line between life and oblivion was drawn not only by strength or skill, but by imagination, compassion, and the ability to dream beyond the darkness. And so, the inheritance of those distant ancestors is found not just in the tools we hold or the shelters we build, but in the hearts that still gather around light, the minds that still seek meaning in hardship, the hands that still reach out in the cold. The first winter taught humanity what it truly meant to be human, not just to survive, but to hope, to share, to create. In every tradition that warms us, in every fear and every dream, their story endures, quietly guiding us home each time the world turns cold.